Case closed in 3034. Essay on the need for intervention. Chapter 1. The highway accident. There had been no contact for 43 years, and we assumed they had perished. Two civilians, Mr. Moore and Mr. Oashi, reported a collision in the intersectorial connection tunnel near the bridge that connected to the mainland. Apparently, a vehicle had collided with the arched protection, leading to a controlled atmosphere leak. The area was sealed off by the automatic containment system, preventing the passage in detailed view for the two drivers. A tunnel maintenance team was dispatched to the location. It was uncommon for an entire section of the road to rupture, causing an area of that size to be sealed. Normally, minor repairs, such as replacing deteriorated coatings and joints, were carried out over time. During these repairs, sensors and injection jets would reverse the contamination of the interior air, and the flow of vehicles would continue normally. The team consisted of rotating staff members who worked in shifts throughout the year. In fact, few workers dedicated more than 3 months to any specific activity. So, although they performed such tasks, they lacked sufficient experience to deal with this unusual situation. Only the maintenance coordinator, Agnes Hill, had witnessed a collision before. Vehicles are essentially safe. There is no room for errors in the narrow tunnels. An accident with another vehicle is practically impossible due to the presence of automatically activated anti-collision systems. However, a slight sideswipe could occur if a driver deliberately positioned themselves on a collision course with another vehicle, and the system chose to swerve in the opposite direction as the option with less damage. Even so, the rupture of the structure was almost impossible. In the case that Hill had witnessed, there were only scratches on the coating and slight gaps in the interchangeable joints. Upon encountering the undamaged but melted coating, Hill was intrigued. The vehicle that caused the rupture was partially destroyed. It was evident that it wasn't equipped with wheels. They concluded that it had fallen from the outside to the inside and from top to bottom, but there was no part that identified it as any known aircraft. Approaching what appeared to be the area designated for the occupant, they found something so disconcerting that they couldn't describe it accurately. The coordinator contacted the university, and while reporting in a breathless and superficial manner, the call was transferred to the laboratory complex of CPBM. He spoke with Dr. Alberto Jimenez, the department head. The creature found in the vehicle was taken to Laboratory 26 of CPBM on the night of March 18, 3032. The specimen was analyzed by Jimenez and Dr. Aidan Call, the general coordinator of CPBM. The humanoid form was not naked as described by those who found it. It was wearing a white suit that resembled rubber, fitting tightly to the body. When the fabric was cut with a scalpel, it immediately inflated as if it had a layer under negative pressure. The creature had small mouth and nostrils on its face. The chest and abdomen appeared to be underdeveloped. Upon examining the eyes, they made a striking discovery. There was no sclera, only something resembling a large black iris. They then discovered that it was another protective layer, similar to a second set of eyelids, with a corneal consistency. They believed it served as a light filter. Dr. Jimenez continued the incision and came face to face with the horrifying truth upon reaching the respiratory system, 7 glands attached to the lung tissue. Chapter 2. The Manufacturing Revolution. Marco could hardly believe what he had just read. Now that the shock and disbelief of the initial encounter had passed, he became increasingly intrigued, not only by this world that seemed so different from his own, but also by the role he would play in this story. Why did it have to be him? Let's recapitulate and fast forward a few years to understand how this process unfolded. The advancement of 2 technological tools brought about a transformation in the way of life on the planet. They emerged almost simultaneously, mutually contributing to each other's development. The first tool was the molecular assimilator, an evolution of the concept of 3-dimensional printing. It enabled the manufacturing of any organic or inorganic matter, using only the constituent information of the object to be synthesized. The information could be extracted from a scanning chamber located at the front of the device. It had an internal volume of 500 liters, with an adapter and a suspended rod for larger structures. Not only could physical copies of known objects be synthesized, but these constituents could also be shared or downloaded from the central library. The library contained a compendium of all essential structures, treasures of humanity and nature, such as air, water, fruits, vegetables, permitted cultivation plants, wood, animal parts, polymers, fabrics, glass, metals, chemical compounds, and more. The list was continuously updated over the years by the early users, and any item could be used for free. Additionally, objects protected by intellectual property rights or patents could be acquired in the common market, such as art, medicine, clothing, ready-made recipes, kitchen utensils, furniture, household appliances, vehicle parts, or even entire vehicles synthesized in parts. In short, anything that had been conceptualized by someone and still held rights or patents. However, this process required a significant amount of energy for synthesis, cooling, and maintenance of the machine, as well as the production of raw materials and treatment of waste. It was in the second half of the 21st century that the concept of energy production reached a new level. Nuclear fusion became viable. These two discoveries brought about significant transformations in society. Nuclear fusion presented real execution risks. The construction of the power plants alone required resources never before considered by any nation. However, the benefits would be virtually perpetual. There were also concerns about equipment maintenance, although wealthier sovereign states considered themselves capable of hosting their own units. It was common sense that developing countries would eventually request the right to have their own units in the following decades. It was understood that the process would become commonplace, increasing the possibility of failures. 2 accidents during the experimental phases of the reactors, one in Brazil and another in India, resulted in the loss of thousands of civilian lives. Thus, the consortium model of nations was adopted. Many of them were already financing the project that led to the discovery of fusion. These nations were given a smaller participation in the funding of the construction of the units. An agreement was reached with another 84 countries, defining a centralized energy production model with distribution networks from north to south. Global power plants were established in polar regions, with the Arctic Circle's plant being 1/3 larger. The era of cheap and even surplus energy production had never occurred in human history. It was in this reality that the molecular assimilator, also known as AM, named after the first prototype developed by engineer Chaos Naviraseth, evolved from a promising and experimental technology to a necessity. However, the main obstacle to the viability of AMNs was the production of inputs. With the advent of fusion energy, the production of inputs grew exponentially. There was only one structure that the device couldn't reproduce, a structural component of one of the 4 flux recondensers that the AMM possessed. This limitation was intentional. The component was made of a metallic alloy, the formula of which was kept secret, and 2 elements of it couldn't be provided by any input package. This was the security measure that the company holding the production rights had to ensure that consumers couldn't reproduce an AMN using another one. The industrial production of food and anything that could be manufactured, cultivated, or handled by humans could be produced by the machine. There was still a small part of the trade that existed until the popularization of AMNs. It sustained itself by selling products to those who didn't have the device, such as associations of merchants. 2 or 3 butcher shops invested in buying an assimilator and started selling synthesized meat, which could be personalized with low, high, or zero fat content. Some foods with saturated fats could be artificially enhanced with unsaturations in their organic chains, releasing fewer free radicals and making the food healthier. Some people with dietary restrictions on animal slaughter could consider consuming these synthesized meats, as they were just replicas. Others raised concerns about the uncalculated risk of relying solely on artificial food. Guy Green, a company created by an association of nutritionists and small producers, cultivated alternative foods made naturally. It thrived for a short period, particularly among certain segments of society, The fact is that price, convenience, and taste were advantages associated with synthetic foods. Subsequent studies would prove that they were actually healthier. Gradually, companies like Gaia Greens ceased to exist as well. Chapter 3. Inputs. Inputs are refills of molecular components used by assimilators for the production of various items. They are stored in cylindrical containers with thousands of microfilaments. These fragments are immersed in inert excipients of a pasty consistency, suitable for the respective charges of each radical. There are 16 types of input packages, 3 containing ions of inorganic elements, and 13 with groups of organic arrangements. In a way, only the 3 inorganic packages could synthesize an organic molecule, using the carbon microfilament to build an organic molecule from scratch. However, this process proved to be slow and costly. For this reason, the other organic packages that contained pre-molded hydrocarbon radicals were chosen. In the case of manufacturing an apple, for example, let's take a very simple synthesis as our basis, table salt. To produce a salt grain, sodium chloride, it would be necessary to combine an alkali metal with a halogen. The assimilator did not use the compound itself. It was actually a molecular level imprint, 1 ion of each element, respecting the intermolecular space of each compound, as well as isomerism and other peculiarities. The range of synthesizable substances was not limited to what already existed. The device contained an interface for experimentation. Over time, people began to manufacture derivatives of known structures. They altered the taste and consistency of food, or maintained the taste while changing the nutritional components. Any calorie or restrictive diet could be followed by consuming only foods that please the user's palate. Chapter 4. Humans Beyond the Century. Scanning and synthesis techniques were adapted for other areas such as medicine and the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical chemistry was refined to such an extent that it was possible to know, with an unprecedented level of detail, the composition of viruses, bacteria, parasites, and cells of the human body itself. Thus, synthesizing new drugs that would interact with these agents occurred much more precisely. Furthermore, an entire organ could be replicated in an AMN. This extended the life expectancy of the global population by decades. However, it was the proposal of biochemical intervention on S receptors or biochemical intervention on SORM G receptors that created the concept of manufacturing a receptor that would be common to all cells of the body. Built organically like any other natural membrane receptor, it would use chemical mediators to alter cellular functions. However, it would act in a much more complex and comprehensive manner. It could prevent or accelerate cellular apoptosis, protect DNA from natural degeneration or degeneration induced by external agents, mobilize defense cells against infectious agents, and prevent the body's attack in the case of autoimmune diseases. All of this could be activated when needed. It functioned as an easily accessible gateway to the body. Therefore, it was necessary to determine where the problem was located, directing the cure for any disease and even preventing aging. The idea was to mark each receptor with a unique chemical signature. Each cell that constituted the human body would have a serial number and could be mapped. Trillions of keys that could be accessed by synthesized chemical mediators for any purpose. People slept in adapted chambers with a scanning device that searched for any defects or degeneration in each cell of the individual. In the morning, the AMM synthesized a pill with chemical mediators and replacement cell packages ready to intervene in the receptors and cellular structures, depending on the needs diagnosed the previous night. As with any revolution, interests, doctrines, and behaviors are reviewed, created, and tested. The almost innocuousness of human action in the routine of cities, the absence of great personal achievements, and the devaluation of the fear of death seem to negatively impact the mind. Rates of neurological disorders such as anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia increased as most other diseases were eradicated. These facts appeared to be closely connected. A British nurse named Margaret Lewis suffered from severe headaches accompanied by frequent hallucinations. She reported to the healthcare service that she could see the people around her, but she described them differently, as if they had no eyes, only large black orbits. Mrs. Lewis was placed under rest and observation. Sedative hypnotic medications were administered to make her sleep. However, even under strong sedation, signs of anxiety could be observed, as if the hallucinations persisted during her sleep. Blood tests showed almost normal values, only the oxygen saturation seemed to be altered. Since the patient was not using a ventilator, the attending physician understood that it could be a collection or device reading error. He requested that this test be repeated and attached the request to the medical record. He also suggested reducing sedation for evaluation of the patient. With the decrease in sedation, Margaret woke up later that night. Upon awakening, she found the hospital room in darkness. She looked to the side and saw a man lying on his side with his back turned to her. She believed it was her husband, Joseph. She called out to him with her weak and hoarse voice. The man turned slowly, and she could see a person without a face. A hole the size of where the eyes, nose, and mouth should be occupied their features. The creature reached out its arm towards her, and its fingers seemed to elongate, trying to reach her body. Hours later, Margaret was found dead. A social and religious controversy arose when her husband tried to refabricate the deceased wife in his assimilator. It was already known that the machine could produce organic tissues. Therefore, in theory, it would be possible to manufacture a human being. But what separates a living human body from a non-living one is not only the quantity and conformation of present molecules. Thus, the machine only produced corpses. Frightened, the man contacted the hospital's emergency services, which, upon arrival and confronted with two identical bodies, caused a great uproar. Months later, they discovered a maniac who made copies of known individuals and, after violating them, discarded them in a ditch excavated in one of the rooms of his house. These, among other events, led to control and monitoring of activities related to organic synthesis. Chapter 5. On synthesizing life. This question has been the subject of prolonged discussion for many years. What separates an inanimate object from a living body? What gives a tangle of chemical components purpose, producing and consuming energy, manufacturing copies, and evolving? These concepts do not appear to be random. Experiments in completely sealed chambers have been attempted in the past. Even when all the necessary organic elements for life are assembled, once the internal environment is sterilized, no microorganisms spontaneously appear from a chemical soup. Except for cystic forms, spores, encapsulated organisms, and extremophiles that protect themselves from disintegration caused by natural or artificial factors, nothing else emerges from these attempts. These organisms have never been dead, but rather in a state similar to hibernation. However, even among them, once the abstract factor of life is removed, it is impossible to restore it. The assimilators achieved a level of precision never before imagined in the reproduction of organic tissues. Let's take the synthesis of a part of lost muscle tissue in an accident as an example. The machine would scan the affected area, and a mold would be reconstructed at the molecular level, reproducing every filament of actin and myosin, as well as adjacent connective tissues and tendons. The final piece fit perfectly in the affected area. Initially, the reproduced muscle obeyed all commands from the limb to which it was grafted. However, after a few days, a discoloration appeared at the insertion site. The tissue was not alive. It could not nourish itself from the circulatory system. The solution was to create a nanoparticle capable of replacing defective artificial cells, denatured proteins, and any other type of damage, something that the organism naturally does on a daily basis. It was futile to attempt to reproduce a human being, an animal, or any other living being. There is no way to attribute consciousness or any metaphysical value to matter, no matter how chemically faithful the copy may be. Chapter 6. The Catastrophe. Society thrived for a relatively short period, like a plateau before the decline of a reaction. It is ironic that the negative influence of progress brought by humans to the planet was judged for a long time. Perhaps due to this type of thinking, no one could predict what would come next. Human actions on Earth, energy production, food cultivation, and promotion of the modern way of life, emitted tons of carbon compounds into the air every year. These compounds accumulated in large quantities in the atmosphere. Some contributed as greenhouse gases, while another portion was converted into oxygen by terrestrial plants and marine algae. What no one knew is that this increase in the supply of carbon dioxide triggered a response from the planet. Autotrophic organisms that consumed the gas gradually increased their conversion rate since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There was no study that proved an increase in photosynthesis, or if there was, it was not widely known. With centuries of human activity, plants became more effective at converting carbon dioxide into oxygen. With the cessation of food cultivation, industrial production, and primarily the change in the energy matrix, the injection of carbon dioxide from human sources abruptly dropped in the atmosphere. The organisms that performed this conversion no longer worked with concentrations from the pre-industrial era, so an imbalance in the exchange was inevitable. The planet became supersaturated with oxygen within a matter of months. The balance on the planet is much like that of a single organism. Instead of trying to understand something as positive or negative, it is necessary to understand that there are safe concentration limits for each substance in nature. Oxygen is vital for humans and animals, but in high concentrations, it can become toxic. The emergency solution was the development of a controlled atmosphere injector that could be synthesized in the AMNs. This injector would maintain a closed environment with breathable air. However, this marked the beginning of molecular input production. Less than 10% of the population had their own assimilator. When the first signs appeared, many people began to hallucinate, causing mass hysteria. The few who possessed the technology locked themselves in their homes. Local small businesses closed, and those left outside perished. Chapter 7. Photosynthesis. Life on Earth, although seemingly fragile, has already undergone numerous tests of near sterilization of the planet. Celestial impacts, volcanism, extreme climate, and other forms of mass extinction have at times pushed the world to the brink of desertification. All these events share the common characteristic that the planet has managed to heal itself afterwards. The biosphere is capable of absorbing, understanding changes, and adapting, no matter how critical they may be. However, the same cannot necessarily be said for species. Most organisms have a delicate relationship between the factors that contribute to their prosperity and their inevitable extinction. Time plays a crucial role in the adaptability of species to environmental changes. Generations have a better chance of success than an individual organism. Certain characteristics stand out in the new scenario, and the success of these individuals becomes the rule for those to come. The emergence of humans can be compared to a global-scale event in terms of the planet's equilibrium. Humanity transforms nature to suit its needs. For a long time, it was believed that nature would passively succumb to human aggression. As mentioned earlier, the planet has adapted to more catastrophic events. That's what happened. Some species took greater advantage of human presence, while others perished, and the rest adapted. Photosynthesis accompanied the increase in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Plants and algae that produced more energy grew and reproduced more. The conversion rate kept increasing. Humans acted on Earth, and Earth reacted. The reaction occurred gradually, as was the case with the growth of carbon dioxide emissions. However, a drastic change also generates a drastic reaction. The reasoning is the same. The balance depends on the time it takes for these transformations to occur. The complete cessation of so-called air pollution within a matter of years caused not only a reaction, but also evidence that had never been considered, perhaps because we were too preoccupied with thinking about the deleterious effects, categorizing behaviors, discoveries, and progress as either good or bad. Chapter 8. The Change. Initially, the unbalanced conversion had a greater impact on large animals. The excessive exposure to oxygen led to confusion, disorientation, and the death of many species. The number of fires multiplied in farms and forests due to the high concentration of the gas. At the time, it seemed like a good idea not only to allow the fires, but also to encourage them. This way, more carbon dioxide could be injected into the atmosphere, destroying part of the organisms causing the imbalance. However, this proved to be futile. The majority of the conversion came from marine algae, and even if poisoning all the oceans were considered as a desperate measure, there was not enough time for that. The drastic reduction of a fundamental component of the greenhouse effect resulted in a loss of heat in the following 50 years, reducing the global temperature on a scale never before detected by current methods. These levels had only been suggested in ice core samples from events that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. This reduction extended the diameter of the polar ice caps. Each year, the white masses advanced toward the sea in both poles. The deflection of solar radiation into space increased with the expanding white area. As a result, the Earth received less and less radiated heat. These processes, combined with the inefficiency of the greenhouse effect, fed into each other. The colder it got, the more ice was created. This layer of ice grew toward the equator until only a valley separated the two halves of the globe. The planet had become a vast snowball. Daylight could cause serious damage to vision. The endless expanse of white ocean reflected a significant amount of radiation. All surfaces, not only of residences but also of patios, communal areas and connections, were fitted with brightness filters. The suits designed for exploration in the external territory featured an atmosphere equalizer, protection against extreme cold, and a brightness filter in the visor. Chapter 9. The Chosen Ones of Svalbard. There were only a few people left in isolated cities, less than 1 million to be precise. Not everyone who possessed the assimilator survived. Some states didn't even have it within their territory. Residences and government headquarters were attacked. When society realigned itself, these individuals became distant from each other, making it difficult to maintain the power distribution lines. The solution found was to divide society into 2 communities near the power plants, one in Bergen, Norway, and the other in Ushuaia, in southern Argentina. Houses became containers with controlled atmosphere, interconnected by surface tunnels with transparent ceilings. These tubes lead to larger connections, and those lead to remaining public spaces such as universities. Although some activities were no longer necessary due to the end of manufacturing, people still worked. Some maintained the operation of the power plant, while others worked in the production of resources. The majority produced intellectual property, food, furniture, and simulators that could be acquired and synthesized in the assimilators. 2 physically separated communities. They gathered for an annual congress, taking turns between the North and the South. On January 25, 2989, Richard Teigen presented the project of the pH modulator, a set of 7 glands attached to the light of the lungs aimed at compensating for the excessive absorption of oxygen and thus enabling exposure to the atmosphere. The attachment of artificial structures to the human body is not uncommon. The use of glasses, hearing aids, and even invasive devices like a pacemaker are examples of this. However, all these technologies have in common the inorganic material from which they are made, the implantation of a new organ, something unnatural that did not improve, enhance, or smooth a bodily function, but rather created a new purpose, was not received as progress, but as a violation of nature. Being a follower of Dr. K.T.N.I.'s ideology, Teigen was deeply irritated by the rejection of his work. He believed that it was the destiny of the human species to reach a technological level that would allow them to intervene in their own evolutionary process. At the end of that same year, a referendum was held to discuss the optional implementation of the pH modulator for those who showed interest in the modification. The result was a defeat for K.T.N.I.'s and Teigen, with 1,817 votes in favor and 84,232 against. However, the application of the law, and therefore the referendum, only concerned the territory of the community. Richard Teigen informed K.T.N.I.'s that he owned a property inherited from his family before the 3rd concentration in the territory of Svalbard, in the North Sea, and that they would have enough energy to accommodate a population of 60 people for 8 months. And so they did. They selected 58 individuals, 20 men and 38 women among the 1,817 defeated in the referendum, and headed north. Chapter 10. K.T.N.I.'s Theory. Edmund K.T.N.I.'s, a psychoarchaeologist, proposed that human thought would reach its peak between the ages of 85 and 90. He understood that previous generations would not be able to achieve the fundamental balance between accumulated knowledge, discernment, and physiological processing capacity due to the deterioration of bodily functions with age. Regarding how humanity should proceed after the cataclysm, his theory was based on 4 points. He argued that in order to reach the evolutionary stage we have reached, we have already used artificial inclusions in our way of life. The development of technologies, the food industry, and medicines were already characterized as alterations in natural selection. In a way, humans were already cheating in evolution. Regarding the cataclysm, he saw it only as one event among many others driven by chance. These events contributed to humanity's current configuration. Cellular replacement, as it is done today, would not be something greater or condemnable, as organ transplants could be considered an artificial extension of life, something that was not questioned in the past. He also challenged the dogmas that arose after the extinction. This was precisely the reason why there was no data on the inevitable impact of years of industrial pollution on carbon converter beings. The idea that human action on the planet was harmful was only a moral attribution in an analysis that should be strictly scientific. The planet's ability to adapt had been underestimated. The pre-cellular replacement generations would not be able to absorb, discern, and execute the concepts we use today, especially collectively. This happened for 2 reasons. The manufacturing revolution made it possible to lose the need for immediate usefulness for every action. Thus, more time remained for fundamental issues and individual and collective well-being. Still, thousands of years of evolution of the central nervous system had accumulated a residual instinct of anguish that prevented everyone from simply enjoying the well-being of this new societal conformation. It was then that, with the biological revolution, it became possible to observe that it was not enough to remove negative stimuli for the human brain to adapt to the new condition, but rather a whole life of accumulated knowledge and experiences that led thought to full maturity. The advance of age, the natural degeneration of the body, happened too early for these neural interconnections to be established. With the advent of life extension, it became feasible to surpass this barrier. Chapter 11. Temporal rifts. After the discovery of the 11 interaction fragments, a schedule was established, and the interviewers called contacts were randomly chosen. It had to be this way. Any knowledge of the content of these documents would render the entire experiment useless. In the chronological order of future time, Marco's fragment would be the last one to be analyzed. This didn't necessarily follow the sequence of events in the past. Before trying to understand the reasons that led the post-cataclysm civilization to seek answers in the 21st century, it would be interesting to comprehend how such mechanics worked. The investigation of the highway accident concluded that the spacecraft did not collide with the barrier in a probable crash. The only plausible explanation is that it materialized irregularly, merging with the adjacent structures in some points. After months of research on the navigation system, the investigators suggested that the device sought natural distortions in space and through them could travel long distances or even break the linearity of time. It was a technology much more advanced than what existed at the time. How this spacecraft could transmute through these distortions was still a mystery, but the navigation device was studied until the entire reverse engineering of the apparatus was complete. The theory derived from the machine was the existence of bridges, distortions, or scratches in the fabric of space-time created by objects traveling at the speed of light. With the right tool, it would be possible to take advantage of these flaws and open a channel that allowed a connection. But how could one make contact with the past if no known object had traveled at the speed of light? Information travels at the speed of light. The information traffic since the beginning of telecommunications created disturbances in space. These were described as malleable fissures of axial distortion. Most of them were very fragile and lasted only a few milliseconds. A few others remained open for long periods of time. These were mapped, thus enabling the determination of when one would open and close. But we don't know how to create them. Apparently, they happen randomly. The reason for this has not yet been fully elucidated. The mapping indicated 11 contacts distributed in different parts of the globe between the years 1998 and 2003. Windows with a specified date and time for the start and end of each junction. Chapter 12. Fragments. The investigation plan for interventions in history began with the search for records of temporal interaction. These could, in theory, be found in media capable of receiving and decoding the information transmitted through the temporal rifts. It was not an easy search. Although the vehicle's navigation system could provide the date and time of each contact, this record could be quite abstract. For example, a phone call. After extensive research in telecommunications company archives, backups of entire servers from the old internet, and encryption in various platforms, all the fragments were found. They constituted unequivocal evidence of a connection between the past and the future, a transcript of a conversation between two beings separated by more than a millennium. But how not to contaminate part of the text with the pre-knowledge of the participants in 3034? The solution would be to choose people who had no contact with the fragments for each interaction. The criteria for selecting these members would be irrelevant because regardless of the choice, it had already been made in theory. The experiment unfolded as follows. The chosen contact stayed in an isolated room with a text or audio interface. They were asked to initiate the conversation with a greeting. Then, almost instantly, the response from the participant in the past was returned. This continued naturally, purely improvised by the contact. The guidance was that any requested information could not be denied. Candor, even if revealing important facts about future history, was necessary to avoid interfering with the research object. This object was not the interviewee, but rather the fragment. Chapter 13. The Modified Ones. The conclusion about the set of glands found in the creature's lungs could not be different. It was a pH modulator. That being was a genetically modified human adapted to survive in the atmosphere. Not only that, the diminutive stature and bone structure seemed to be modified for a purpose. Perhaps to fit inside that spacecraft. An intriguing vehicle, it didn't seem ergonomic inside or aerodynamic outside, as if the design itself was conceived to enable the passage. It had no windows or doors. Instead, it was equipped with a hatch that opened on what was presumed to be the underside. Yes, because it was difficult to define the correct position. The spacecraft was a perfect disk with a metallic coating, resembling aluminum. The inhabitants of Svalbard built that spacecraft. They were attempting for some reason to return to the past. The remaining question was what the motive would be. The thing is, manufacturing organic matter, no matter how efficient the process, is a rather complex task. In the human genome, there are nuances that go beyond the biochemical arrangement of DNA chains. Over the course of years, decades, centuries of molecular replacement, there is practically no membrane, cell, or nuclear component that has not been artificially replaced. It is believed that this fact prevents the modified ones from making progress in the genetic enhancement they desire. They would need intact samples that are no longer available in their time. Going back in time, collecting human samples, and returning with them would certainly leave traces. Researching publications from that era, it was not difficult to identify these encounters. Hundreds of them. Cases of people being abducted in the 20th and 21st centuries, extraction of genetic material, and complex experiments. There were even reports of an accident with one of the larger spacecraft, with 3 crew members, where the modified ones were captured by the local army at the time. The extreme importance of investigating these interactions and understanding how such violence against the natural course of time could affect life on the planet became evident. The analysis of the fragments would be crucial in understanding the consequences of these actions. Chapter 14. Marco's Fragment. Marco was 20 years old on September 24, 2003. He was in his third year of studying physics at college. In his free time, he maintained a personal blog that he updated almost daily. He mostly published thoughts and opinions about books, games, and movies. When he came across that email, he thought it might be some kind of prank, not only because of the subject line "from the future," but also because he couldn't identify the sender. Instead of an email account, he saw a sequence of characters that made no sense when put together. He decided not to pay much attention to it at first. He returned to his blog. After making a post about a book he had just read, he immediately received another message from the same sender. Upon opening the correspondence, he realized it was a perfect transcription of the text he had just published. Intrigued, this time he decided to respond, questioning who was playing this joke on him, but he couldn't send anything to the user. Soon after, he received a random message from an undetermined account. He realized that whoever was doing this was someone who observed his blog. He decided to type the question on the platform itself in an attempt to discover the author of these messages. The response came immediately to his inbox. It was the contact, the one assigned to Marco. At that moment, the analysis of the fragment began. Neither Marco nor the contact would have access to the document. The conversation flowed naturally. Marco posted the questions, and the answers arrived without delay in less than a second. Sometimes there were long passages, perhaps too long to be typed in such a short time. It couldn't be said that he fully believed in the story being told to him, but as the narrative progressed, there grew an expectation that all of it might be real. The contact didn't deny any information. The dialogue was candid. The mechanics of their communication, future events, and even the cataclysm were discussed. It had to be this way. That's how the experiment was conceived. All the fragments before Marco's went through the same procedure. The conversation continued until close to the end of the window, when Marco was informed about the accident on the highway and the evidence of the first modified. Chapter 15. Tegan's Plan. The transgressions of the Tegan and KTNIS community now extended beyond the limits of genetic modification and interfered with history itself. The detailed analysis of the fragments aimed primarily at determining the least aggressive response to natural laws, since any sense of restraint was already lacking on the side that first broke them. At the same time, one could not ignore the desperate motivation that led the modified to take such action. Without new natural components, their own existence would be threatened in a few years. It would be impossible to replace cellular constituents with artificial structures alone. Even a newborn carried a large amount of artificial molecular arrangements, as gametes were also contaminated. Furthermore, the modified children were altered before birth, and all the phenotypic characteristics useful for survival in the external world were already apparent in the developing fetus. Major alterations, such as the inclusion of a pH modulator in the lungs, were performed surgically years later. However, the issue of the lack of natural genetic material affected everyone to some extent. The abrupt manner in which the modification occurred in the modified was merely an acceleration of a process that the entire community had been exposed to since the beginning of the use of replacement pills. Perhaps a few decades in the future, all human beings would have to face the same dilemma. Chapter 16. Essay on the Need for Intervention. As a last attempt to violate the natural order of the interview, the coordinators entered the room where the temporal interaction between Marco and the contact was taking place. In the analysis of all previous fragments, not even a moment of hesitation occurred when comparing the known document to the interaction that followed. Every word fit perfectly into the pre-existing transcript that the analysts held in their hands. It was the final portion of the last fragment. Putting the rules of the experiment itself to the test would be the ultimate test to reach an irrefutable conclusion. At this moment, Marco wondered what mission would be assigned to him to try to prevent this catastrophe. He desperately questioned what he should do so that billions of people wouldn't lose their lives. The coordinator took control of the interface and promptly responded, "No, Marco, it's not a plan, an appeal, or a mission. We are analyzing your speech. After analyzing 10 other pieces of evidence of interaction with the past identical to this one, we concluded that it doesn't matter what actions the modified individuals take in the past or future. There is no way to alter the course of history. What has happened is happening and will happen. The very existence of this moment, your awareness of the facts, is irrelevant or contributes to the inevitable flow of time. I'm sorry that someone has to live with this kind of knowledge about their own destiny. But it couldn't be any other way. I feel obligated to at least put an end to any doubts that might torment you in the years to come. At this moment, Marco receives one last email. It contains no written words, only an image file. It is the fragment, a reproduction of his words in the final moments. Upon careful observation, he realizes that the image is incomplete. The upper part of a sentence spoken by Marco has been cut off by the image's limit, but Marco hasn't typed that sentence yet. If the fragment is real, it needs to be complete for the destiny to truly be inevitable. He just needs to never conclude that conversation. Perhaps one event depended on the other. Perhaps it was evidence that the experiment coordinator was wrong. Either way, it would be hope for the catastrophe not to come true. He decided never to send that sentence. To make sure, he accessed his blog account and chose to delete the post once and for all. When closing his account on the platform, he came across a standard message from the server. A set of words beneath his last posts that fit perfectly with those cut off by the fragment's image. Closed by the author.